Okay, in New Jersey, child is undergoing initial evaluation. She'll be given an educational and psychological eval. If I disagree with the recommendations at the eligibility meeting, can I ask for an independent education evaluation in an area that was not initially evaluated, like speech language? First of all, let me stop there. If you signed consent and they're going through the process, or not that it's going to help you now. Well, they're probably still within that time frame. I don't know when you signed consent. They have 60 days from the point that you signed consent, so I don't know where you are in that process. But you can always go back, because it doesn't take them that much time to do an in-house speech language evaluation. And for all parents out there, when you're sitting in these meetings and they're asking for your consent and there's a area that you want evaluated because you suspect or you would like that considered, the school district has a responsibility to thoroughly evaluate your child. And not just for the purposes of determining eligibility. In this particular situation, because it is an initial evaluation, then the justification that you provide for the school is that they need to rule things out. Okay? And so therefore, because speech language impairment is a component or its own exceptionality, they need to rule it out. So they do need to do one, which means that if you're still in that time frame that they're doing the evaluations and they haven't had the eligibility meeting yet, then I would go back to them and say, hey, I want to give consent because I want you guys to do a speech language evaluation. Then you just negated your problem of having to deal with that later. If they're in the middle of evaluations, there is nothing that says you can't go back and say, hey, we forgot to cover this. I want to give my consent. It's a very simple way to do that. But if you're past the initial evaluation, guys, and you're sitting in that meeting and you are staring at consent and you would like an area evaluated, bring it up. Everybody's human, and sometimes teachers aren't, or educators aren't thinking about all of the different areas of potential deficit that needs to be taken into consideration, because continued eligibility or eligibility is only one component of why we evaluate. We also evaluate to determine your child's baselines or their current levels of functioning, present levels of performance, so that we understand where the goals need to be crafted. Here's the baseline, here's the goal, and then that's where services come in. It also helps us determine supplemental aids and services. So speech language, I think, would be a very important thing to evaluate. So let's finish this. So, yeah, in order to ask for an independent education evaluation, it would need to be tied to evaluations already done. Okay, so yes, if you did not have a speech language evaluation done, then at that point, the school system may go, yeah, we'll give you an independent evaluation of speech language, to just get you out of their hair. And at the same time, they do have a right of first refusal, which means that they may want to say, well, let us do one in-house before that puts you in a position to ask for an independent. But they do have a right of first refusal. Okay. Now, also, what constitutes a geographical area in terms of evaluators you can request complete the evaluation for an independent? That's called agency criteria. Okay. Now, under independent evaluation, the school district has a choice. They can either fund it or they can file due process to defend their evaluations. That gets stupid and it gets pricey. Now, if they agree to fund your independent evaluation in whatever area they tested in, then at that point, you can choose whoever you want, but within a very reasonable, what's called agency criteria. Now, what composes agency criteria? Every school should have an agency criteria. Most states will also recommend that the schools provide you a list of providers. Well, that's just because most parents don't have a clue, if there's an audiologist in their area, something or a professional that they didn't even know that their child had needs in those areas. So that's why the feds or the state's departments of education recommend providing parents a list. That's for the parents who may not know who's available. But that doesn't limit you to their list, okay? The only thing that's a limiting factor is what's called the agency criteria. And schools need to have agency criteria. Some don't, and that's stupid. Because if you don't have an agency criteria, then you can't establish limits, reasonable limits. Now, what are the reasonable limits? Geographic boundary. So, for example, a school system can say that you have to choose a professional within 100 miles of the school boundaries. All right, depending on where you live, that's very reasonable. If you live in a very rural western states, 100 miles wouldn't get you outside of to the next town. Okay, I mean that happens in New Mexico where we have an office. I mean, 100 miles just doesn't take you very far. In New Jersey, it takes you far, 100-mile radius. Okay. But something reasonable like that, licensure, they can sit there and say that it needs to be somebody licensed in the state of New Jersey, and then also that the provider or the professional charges the community rate for that particular field, and that's about it. That's about all the limiting factors that they can put on your selection. Okay. And then within that, there are exceptions where a parent can go outside of that agency criteria, but they would need to explain that for consideration by the team. Okay?